Retired rancher lived alone for years, until 5 Apache women begged for shelter on his ranch. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The land stretched quiet in every direction, empty fields broken only by scrub brush and the long wooden fence line that ran alongside the ranch. The air was cold enough to numb fingers, and the sky had already turned deep blue, only a thin line of dying orange left along the distant hills. Nothing moved except a few loose strands of hay by the barn door and the slow shift of horses settling for the night. The rancher, Walter Hale, stood near the corral gate with his gloves still on, rope over one shoulder, and a dull ache in his back from a long day. He had spent his daylight hours repairing fence posts, checking trough water, and cutting firewood. No one else had done those jobs for 10 years. He didn't rush through anything. He worked the same way every day because routine kept things steady and quiet. And quiet meant nothing could surprise him the way life once had. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of his glove and looked out toward the hills. No smoke from town, no riders, no noise except the low whinny of a horse adjusting itself. It felt safe enough, safe in the only way this land ever was. He reached for the cabin door, boots creaking on the porch boards, and stepped inside. The cabin was small but solid. A stove in the corner, iron kettle on top, table with 2 chairs though one hadn't been touched in years, coat hung on a wooden peg by the door. The place smelled of old firewood and leather. He poured himself coffee from a tin pot he'd reheated for the 3rd time that day. The cup burned his fingers slightly, but he held it anyway, liking the sting. It reminded him he was still here, still real. Walter wasn't hiding from the world. He was done with it. Once a cavalry tracker in border country, he left after watching enough death and fear to last a lifetime. His wife passed 4 winters later from illness, and whatever part of him that still cared for noise and company went with her. These days he worked, slept, and tried not to think about who he used to be. He didn't want to be a soldier again. He didn't want neighbors or conversation. He wanted quiet work and a roof that didn't leak. He lifted the cup halfway to his lips before the horses outside shifted suddenly, hooves scraping the ground in a nervous burst. His hand stilled. For one solid second, nothing happened. Then he heard it. Movement where there shouldn't be any. Not animal. Too controlled. Too slow. Human footsteps in the dirt. His heartbeat tightened and his jaw clenched. He set his cup down, grabbed the repeating rifle leaning near the door, and stepped back outside. His breath fogged instantly. Every muscle tensed like they used to when he expected an ambush. He scanned the yard. Fences intact. Corral still shut. Horses alert, ears pointed toward the barn. Then shadows moved along the barn wall. His thumb brushed the rifle lever out of habit. He stepped down 2 porch steps, boots landing heavy. When the figure stepped into lantern light spilling from his cabin window, his breath paused and his chest point 5 women stood there. Apache, thin from travel, dresses worn and torn, beads dusty, hair tangled from wind. They looked like they had walked farther than a horse should carry anyone. Their breathing was uneven. Their shoulders sagged. One woman held her ribs. Another leaned on her sister. The youngest looked barely 18, arms wrapped tight around herself like she expected someone to strike her. Walter kept the rifle lowered but ready. No yelling. No sudden moves. He had learned long ago that panic killed faster than bullets. His mind moved steady, scanning them. No weapons he could see. No men nearby. Not scouts. Not raiders. They looked scared, exhausted, and desperate. Things he recognized from war, but this was different. These were people running from something, not toward it. The oldest woman stepped forward 1 pace. She didn't raise her hands but kept them visible. "We walk long," she said, voice strained. "We look for safe place. We need rest." Her English was clear enough. Her eyes did not plead. They braced, as though she expected refusal or violence more than help. Walter knew that look. He had worn it once, arriving in towns where uniform bought suspicion instead of shelter. He could have told them to move on. It would have been easy to do. Most men out here wouldn't have opened the door, let alone offered a place to sleep. Apache women traveling alone usually meant danger close behind. But he also saw cracked lips, torn moccasins, shaking legs, faces marked with fear that had gone on too long. He felt a tight pull in his chest he hadn't felt in years, something like memory trying to become guilt he swallowed. "Barn's clean," he said quietly. "Water at the door. Hay in the loft." For a moment, none of them moved, not out of disrespect but disbelief. Then they nodded, slow, tired, grateful in a quiet way. They didn't thank him. Pride wouldn't let them. Instead, they supported each other and walked toward the barn. No noise, no wasted movement. Just 5 people trying to stay upright. Walter stayed on the porch, rifle lowered, eyes tracking them until the barn door shut behind their tired bodies. Horses settled again. The wind picked up a little, pushing cold into his coat collar. He breathed out and realized his palms were damp with sweat. Fear, or something close to it, that he returned inside. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, like the world had moved closer to him than he liked. He set the rifle down, but didn't walk away from it. He sat at the table and stared at his coffee. His hand shook slightly when he picked it up. Not age. Nerves. He wasn't used to anyone crossing his land at night. The quiet life had numbed him, and sudden change rattled him more than he wanted to admit. But under the worry sat something else. Not regret. Not anger. Something uneasy that he didn't have a word for yet. He listened to the faint rustle of hay from the barn. No crying. No begging. Just breathing and shifting bodies try to rest. He leaned back, staring at the dark ceiling, and thought about the years he had spent telling himself he owed nothing to anyone. Tonight, that felt less true than it used to. He did not know why they came. He didn't know what danger followed them. But he had made a choice, and choices had weight. Tomorrow would be different because tonight had happened. And for the first time in a long time, Walter Hale did not know if quiet would return here again, or if he wanted it to. Morning arrived without warning, pale light slipping through cabin shutters as if testing whether it was welcome. Walter woke before full sun, same as always, but his moment of stillness felt different today. For 10 years, silence greeted him at dawn. Today, he heard the horses outside shifting, and beneath that, faint movement from the barn. Not loud, just enough to remind him the world had entered his land overnight. He sat on the edge of his bed, boots waiting, coat on the chair. His chest felt tight, not from work but from the unknown. 5 strangers rested on his property. 5 lives he didn't understand or trust yet. He rubbed his face once, let out a slow breath, and forced his body upright. Routine mattered. Routine kept his mind steady. He reached for his coat, pulled it on, and stepped outside into sharp morning cold. Frost clung to grass beside the porch. The sky was clear, washed in gray-blue before sunrise, like the world hadn't decided on its color yet. He walked toward the barn without hurry, boots crunching frozen dirt. Halfway there he paused. The loft door was cracked open, and pale smoke floated from a small fire pit dug just outside the barn door. They had made a cook fire. Controlled. Careful. Not reckless. Someone thought ahead. He stood there a moment, studying the quiet shapes moving near the barn. 4 women crouched close to the low flame, warming hands. The youngest sat leaning against the barn wall, rubbing her ankle with careful fingers. The one who held her ribs last night moved more slowly than the rest, holding herself stiff like pain woke with her too. The 5th woman noticed him first. She stood near the water bucket, dipping a small rag inside and wringing it out. When she raised her head, her eyes locked with his, sharp, alert, guarded. She wasn't afraid the way the others were. She was watchful, ready to judge whether his help was real or temporary. Walter nodded once. She didn't look away. Then she returned to washing a shallow scrape on one woman's arm, movements steady and practiced. Questions pushed into his mind one after another, the ones he knew his listeners would ask if they sat in this dirt beside him. Who were these women? Where had they come from? Were soldiers chasing them? Settlers? Their own people? Were they hurt worse than they let on? Would trouble arrive behind them? He didn't ask any of it out loud. He wasn't ready to talk that much. But the questions stayed. "You cook?" he asked instead, keeping his voice level, nodding toward the pot set over the coals. He didn't smell beans or meat, only hot water and a scrap of dry corn. The oldest woman answered without lifting her face fully. "We boil corn." You have food. We not take without asking. Walter's jaw flexed. He didn't like strangers guessing his mind, but she wasn't wrong. He had food. They didn't. They made do with almost nothing. That told him as much about them as any story might. People who wanted handouts acted different. People used to hardship stayed humble around fire. He knelt by the barn door and checked the horse feed trough. It stayed full. Water bucket nearly empty. They hadn't wasted anything. Still cautious. Still controlled. Good signs. You can cook in the cabin if you need, he said. Stove's warmer. The youngest woman flinched like she wasn't sure he meant it. The one with the limp shifted weight on her unsteady leg. The older woman gave him a long look, trying to understand him the same way he tried to understand her. Trust didn't land all at once. It walked slow like a hurt horse. We stay here, she answered quietly. Barn's safe. He didn't argue. He stood, lifted the water bucket, and carried it to the well. On the walk back, he thought about the piece of truth the night didn't give him. They didn't wander this far unless danger chased them. Last night, they looked like they expected the world to shut doors in their face. This morning, they looked like they expected the world to follow them here and finish what hurt them. He set the filled bucket down beside them. You need anything else? He asked. The woman with the braid, the one who had watched him closest, stopped her cleaning and looked at him again. She didn't thank him. She didn't soften. But something shifted in her eyes, something like acknowledgement instead of fear. We help, she said. We work if we stay. Walter didn't blink. Offers of help mattered. People who meant to take didn't offer labor. He nodded once. Fences need checking, would need splitting. The women exchanged glances, not dread, not complaint, but readiness. Work made sense to them. Work felt safer than waiting. He respected that more than he expected. He walked toward the woodpile. A moment later, he heard footsteps behind him, the woman with the braid following, quiet as a shadow. She didn't speak, just waited while he rolled logs off the stack. Her posture was straight despite exhaustion. Her fingers curled into fists as though ready for effort, not charity. You know how to split wood? He asked. She took the axe from him without hesitation and tested its weight. Not cocky, just capable. She swung. The blade sank clean and true. She didn't look at him after, just reached for another log, breathing steady despite tired arms. Walter didn't smile, but something loosened in his chest. He pulled gloves on and stacked split wood beside her. Back at the barn, 3 of the other women headed toward the fence line with ropes and a bucket, the oldest guiding them like someone who'd led before. The youngest stayed by the fire, ankles stiff, stirring the corn slowly. Walter's thoughts moved slower now. Not from confusion, but from realizing the truth. They weren't helpless. They weren't here to hide. They were rebuilding themselves one chore at a time. And whether he planned it or not, his land had become part of that fight. He didn't know their names yet. He didn't know their story. But he knew this. Turning them away now was impossible. Not because he was weak, but because leaving people to freeze and starve would pull him back toward the kind of man he chose never to be again. Routine had changed. Quiet had company. And the ranch wasn't just his anymore. Not fully. He lifted another log, set it upright, and swung the axe. The impact echoed across the yard. Fire crackled behind them. Hooves shifted in the corral. Frost began to melt in patches. Nothing dramatic happened. No speeches, no gratitude. Only work side by side, the kind that built trust one steady breath at a time. Walter didn't look at the woman beside him again, but he felt her presence like another heartbeat in the quiet morning air. This wasn't rescued, it was survival shared, and in the harsh, unforgiving land of the West. That meant more than any promise spoken out loud. The sun climbed slow, warming frost into mud and bringing dust alive on the ranch yard. By mid-morning, smoke from a women's small fire drifted steady, and what stacked by the wall had doubled. Work settled into its own rhythm. Not loud, not rushed, just effort, breath, and dirt on her fingernails. Walter wiped sweat from his forehead with his sleeve and set another log upright. The woman with the braid, he still didn't know her name, lifted freshly split pieces and stacked them without speaking. Her movements were careful, precise. She didn't waste strength. She worked like someone who had done far harder tasks before. He caught himself glancing at her sometimes. Not for beauty, for presence. For the quiet way she scanned the land every few minutes, checking the ridge line, the road, the tree line behind the barn. Someone running from danger didn't stop watching shadows. That brought the questions again. Questions any listener would ask. Were they escaped prisoners? Was someone hunting them? Why were there no men with them? What happened before they reached this place? He didn't ask yet. But answers were coming whether he was ready or not. He finished his last swing and set the axe down. As he walked toward the barn for rope and nails, he saw movement on the ridge above the property. His body reacted first, muscles tight, breath locked, hand ready to reach for the rifle leaning inside the cabin door. Just a lone dust cloud at first, then a horse, a lone rider, approaching slow from the northeast, too direct to be coincidence. He kept his face still and forced his voice steady. Someone's coming. The women stopped at once. The youngest dropped the ladle she was holding. The oldest woman put an arm out, instinctively shielding the injured one beside her. The shy one stepped behind the fence boards. The one with the limp grabbed the younger girl's wrist tight like she did the night they arrived. Only the braided woman stayed still, eyes locked on the rider the same second Walter's did. Fear didn't hit her face first. Anger did. Walter walked to his cabin door without rushing, without looking back at them. Inside, he lifted his rifle off the wall hooks and checked the chamber out of habit. His heartbeat rose, but not uncontrolled. He had lived through too many tense mornings to panic now. He stepped back outside and nodded to the women. Stay behind the barn. Don't run. He didn't want to say if you run, it looks like guilt. But they understood anyway. They disappeared around the barn in seconds, feet moving fast but quiet. Only the braided woman paused long enough to look at him once, her eyes reading him like she needed to know if he was going to betray them. He stared back steady. She moved. The rider grew closer. Coat dusty, saddle worn, rifle strapped to the back. Not military, not a townsman, not someone Walter recognized. The man slowed near the fence, hat low over his eyes, scanning the property like someone expecting trouble. Walter stepped forward, rifle down but visible, posture calm, shoulders squared. The rider nodded once in greeting but didn't smile. Morning. Walter's jaw tightened. Morning. You run this land? The rider asked. Been here a long time. The stranger looked around again, measuring the absence of noise. The fresh would split, the smoke from a fire too small for one man. His gaze paused on the barn door a second too long. Saw movement from the ridge. Looks like you have company. Walter didn't react. Wild animals sometimes wander near. Didn't look like animals. Silence rolled between them like a cold wind. Walter lowered the rifle slightly, enough to show calm but not friendliness. You looking for someone? The rider wiped dirt from his glove. Town sheriff says a group of Apache women ran from a holding camp 3 days north. Said soldiers were supposed to transfer them. They slipped. Town ain't too happy about it. Walter felt heat creep up the back of his neck. Holding camp. He knew what that meant. Not jail. Detention. Displacement. Forced movement. The same kind of place he once guarded in uniform before he walked away in disgust. His jaw clenched hard. The rider studied him. You seen anyone come through here? Walter held the man's stare. His heart kicked once, heavy. Not fear. A decision forming. He could hand them over and return to silence. Or he could do the thing he walked away from soldiers to do, stand where others fell. No, he said, voice flat and sure. Nothing here but stock and fence work. The rider's eyes narrowed like a blade pressed into soft ground. You sure? If someone passed near my land, Walter answered, I'd remember. Silence again. The kind that tested a man's spine. Finally, the rider nodded. If you see anything, sheriff pays coin for word. Walter didn't respond. The rider turned his horse, slow and suspicious. After a moment, he kicked into a trot and moved toward the hill again. Dust swallowed him until he disappeared. Only then did Walter let his breath out. His hand on the rifle eased. He turned slowly toward the barn. The women stood just behind the corner, where he told them to wait. All 5, eyes sharp, chest tight, ready to run or fight. They were listening to every word. They had heard the danger. They had seen him choose. The braided woman stepped forward. Her throat moved as she swallowed. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. Her voice was low, steady, respectful but guarded. You lie for us. Walter shrugged once, expression flat. I told him what needed saying. You risk trouble. I've seen worse trouble. Her eyes softened, not with weakness, but with recognition. She had known men who turned their backs. She had also just seen a man who didn't point. One of the younger women whispered something in Apache, voice shaking faintly, and the oldest woman placed her hand on her cheek in comfort. They weren't used to safety. They weren't used to being believed. Walter cleared his throat. You all right to keep working? The braided woman nodded. We work. We stay hidden if riders come. Walter set the rifle aside and reached for the next log. Good. They returned to their tasks. Slowly at first. Eyes still checking the ridge, shoulders tight from leftover fear. But they worked. Because work meant life, kept moving. Walter swung the axe again, wood splitting clean. His pulse steadied. The women moved across the yard, stronger now than they were last night. The ranch didn't feel like one man's world anymore. It felt like a place where people gathered because they had nowhere else to stand. Safety wasn't promised. Trouble would return. He knew that now. But something inside him, something buried beneath years of silence, had shifted upright like a man rising from dust. He wasn't just surviving alone anymore. He had chosen a side. And for the first time in years, he didn't regret it. By late afternoon, the land had settled back into its usual rhythm. The rider was gone. Dust trail long faded, but tension remained in the air like a held breath no one wanted to release just yet. Walter walked the fence line beside the pasture, hammer at his hip and a coil of wire slung over one shoulder. Behind him, two of the women followed with posts and tools, their steps steady. They worked without a single complaint. Even though exhaustion sat in their eyes like a shadow they had carried for miles, he tested a loosened board, pressed weight against it, nodded once, then hammered the nail firm. The sound of iron striking would echoed in the open field. The women waited until he stepped aside, then lifted a new post into place with practiced precision. He noticed the way they moved together without speaking, as if they had learned to communicate with glances long before arriving here. People didn't gain that kind of wordless coordination unless they had been running, surviving, holding each other up through hardship. Questions crept into his mind again. Questions the listeners would be asking too. How long had they been held in that camp? Did they escape alone? Or did others not make it this far? Were they expecting more to follow? Or worse, someone to drag them back? Walter hammered another nail and forced the questions down. They would answer in time when they trusted him. Pushed too soon, and trust cracked like thin glass. He had lived enough years dealing with scared people to know patience mattered more than force. When the fence section stood secure, he nodded. That'll hold. The older woman beside him, lines of fatigue around her mouth, pride still holding her posture straight, gave a brief nod. Good fence, she said. Strong. The younger girl who limped leaned against the post to ease pressure on her ankle. Walter's brows drew, slightly inward. He hadn't asked yet how she was hurt. He didn't like ignoring wounds, not after years of seeing what infection could do. You twist it running? He asked quietly. She hesitated, glancing at the older woman for permission. When she nodded, the girl finally spoke, barely above a whisper. Soldier horse kicked. Camp. She pressed her fingers around her ankle. Still walk. Just slow. Walter didn't comment. He didn't trust his voice not to carry anger. The idea of soldiers injured civilians, even if it wasn't deliberate, put heat behind his eyes. He breathed slow instead. We'll wrap it tonight, he said. I have cloth and salve. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, like she hadn't expected help from anyone not tied to her by blood. She nodded once, stiff and grateful. They headed back toward the barn as evening pulled across the sky. Chickens clucked near the coop. Wind picked up again, tugging dust along the ground. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the cabin chimney, and he saw the braided woman setting small logs near the door. She looked up when he approached, studying his face before anything else, checking for change, checking for regret, checking if the morning's promise still held. He gave a short nod toward the cabin. I'll bring bandage. Her eyes softened just barely. Respect. Recognition. Not debt. Inside, Walter washed his hands, grabbed a roll of cloth, old salve tin, and a kettle of warm water off the stove. We stepped back outside. One of the women had already boiled corn again. Their food was running thin. That was another question listeners would expect answered. How long could his supplies stretch with 5 extra mouths? Did he have enough? Was he truly prepared to shelter them? Walter had counted his stores earlier without letting anyone see. Sacks of flour, beans, dried pork, coffee, potatoes in the root cellar. Enough for one man for many months. Enough for 6 people if stretched carefully. It would be tight, but manageable. And if winter pinched, he'd find a way. He always had. He knelt in the dirt beside the injured young woman. She held still as he lifted her skirt carefully just above the ankle. Not improper, just necessary. The joint had swollen, skin bruised purple and yellow. She hissed once when he pressed around the bone. Not broken, but strained. Badly. He worked slow, hands steady. Wrap cloth snug, dab salve over bruising. The girl kept her face turned away, but her breathing eased as pressure settled right. When he finished, the braided woman handed him a small leather tie to secure the bandage. Their fingers brushed for half a second. Brief, solid, like a moment of silent agreement. Trust earned, inch by inch. The oldest woman watched from a distance, shoulders easing slightly. Up until now, she still expected danger. Now she saw he wasn't pretending kindness. When he stood, the braided woman finally spoke. "We traveled 2 weeks," she said, voice controlled, giving a piece of truth without showing the whole journey. Hard ground, little food. Walter nodded once. He didn't ask more, even though part of him wanted to. "Rest here tonight. Tomorrow we talk about what comes next." The women glanced between one another, not afraid, but waiting to see if he meant safety beyond one night. He didn't promise anything yet. He wouldn't lie, but his tone held something firm enough to lean on. Nights settled hard, colder than the one before. Stars stretched wide overhead. Walter stood on the porch with rifle resting against the post, watching the tree line, jaw tight. Not paranoid, prepared. If trouble came, it wouldn't find him unaware that he heard soft laughter near the barn. Light, tired, but real. The women spoke softly together, voices carrying a hint of relief. Even grief-softened hearts could still laugh when warmth returned. He sipped coffee and scanned the dark horizon. The ranch didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something in motion, something alive, something worth guarding again that he didn't plan to protect anyone. But here he was, and as the cold wind tugged at his coat, he knew deep down he would stand between them and danger without hesitation. Not because he owed them, not because he was a hero, because choosing silence over cruelty mattered more than peace bought by turning away. And whether he admitted it or not, the quiet life he built now had company, and he didn't mind as much as he should have. Dawn broke without color, just a cold light easing across the plains and slipping through barn slats like someone checking if the world was still there. Walter woke before it fully settled, same habit as always, but when he sat up and pulled on his boots, he paused. A sound carried from outside. Soft voices. Low conversation. Not fear this time. It surprised him enough, he listened a moment before opening the door. The women were already moving. Not rushing. Not hiding. Working. The older one gathered firewood into neat stacks behind the cabin. The shy one cleaned the small cook area. The girl with the bandaged ankle sorted beans from a woven pouch while sitting on a blanket near the barn entrance. And the braided woman, the one whose eyes always took stock of land, wind, and silence first, already had the horses brushed and watered, her hand moving slow across a mare's neck as steam lifted from its breath in the cold morning air. Walter stood on the porch longer than needed, watching without making his presence known. They weren't waiting for permission. They weren't waiting for thanks. They were making themselves useful, showing they intended to stay with dignity, not pitied. Answer another question hanging in the minds of any listener. Were they simply hiding here? Or building something too? They were building. Quietly, carefully, with the kind of discipline forged by necessity. Walter stepped down, boots crunching frost. The braided woman didn't startle. She simply turned and nodded once. He nodded back, a silent morning greeting that felt steadier than words. "Coffee's on," he said. "We come after feed horse," she replied. "You're up early. Not safe to sleep long when hunted." The words came like fact, not drama. That IT was the closest she had come to explaining anything. It confirmed what they all felt. Walter gave a short nod. "You're safe here," he said. It wasn't a promise carved in stone yet, but it wasn't a lie either. Her stare held his for a moment longer, reading doubt, reading conviction. Then she returned to brushing the horse. Inside, he poured coffee into 6 cups. Metal ones he kept stacked on a shelf, some dented, one missing its handle. He set them on the porch rail and then ladled hot water into a pot of soaked oats. Simple food, but enough. When they gathered around, they didn't crowd. They moved slow, respectful of his space. He noticed what listeners would too. They waited for him to sit first. Not because they viewed him as owner, but because survival had taught them to read power before comfort. Walter sat. They followed. They ate in silence at first, the kind that wasn't awkward anymore. A shared quiet between people learning each other's weight in the world. The youngest girl held her cup with 2 hands like warmth itself felt like safety. The shy one glanced at the cabin walls as if studying its shape, memorizing a place not meant to be temporary. Finally, Walter spoke. "What happened to the camp?" The movement stopped. No panic, just a held breath across 5 bodies that he didn't press. He didn't stare at them like interrogation. He just waited. The older woman answered slowly, eyes fixed on her cup. "Men came. Soldiers say we move again. Farther. To new place. Already lost family before. Women left only. We run at night." That silence after was not peaceful. It was heavy with names unspoken and places burned from memory. The braided woman added, "Men who chased us 2 days." She tapped her fingers once on the wood railing, like marking time. "We lose them near river. Think they follow again soon." It filled another gap the listeners would ask. "Why here? Why him? We not look for ranch," she continued quietly. "Just keep moving." "But we saw fire and night. And horses here. We think maybe safe land." "We try." "Could have been the wrong land," Walter said. She looked him in the eye. But wasn't. He didn't answer. Instead, he swallowed his coffee slow, heat rolling through his chest, grounding him. He didn't deserve trust so easily. Not from them. Not from anyone. But they had given it anyway in the only way desperate people could. By arriving with nothing left, he stood. "We finish fence today. And check well pump. If winter hits early, we need water ready." He didn't say you can stay. He didn't need to. The fact he planned chores with them included spoke enough. Before he turned away, the braided woman finally offered something else. Something he hadn't asked for, but wondered silently. "My name Ada Lee," she said quietly. "Means clear path." Walter blinked, caught off guard. She had not offered anything personal until now. The name wasn't just introduction. It was trust, laid down gently like a stone on steady ground. He nodded once, voice low. "Walter Hale." The shy woman spoke next, barely audible. "I am Nolly." Then the older woman, Sani, the one with humor hiding in tired eyes. "Chala." And the youngest, voice fragile but trying to stand strong. Mina. They had names. They existed before fear. "Good," Walter said, clearing his throat. "Names are good." Ada Lee watched him with a slight tilt of her head. "You had wife?" she asked. Not accusation, not fear, just observation, because he always set 6 cups but slept alone. He stiffened, breath catching slightly. "I did," he said quietly. "A long time ago." "You loved her," Ada Lee said. Not question, just truth, yes. "Her spirits see you still." Walter paused mid-breath. He didn't believe in spirits anymore. But hearing it didn't hurt. It didn't threaten. It settled somewhere quiet inside him, next to grief that had stopped being sharp years ago and turned into something softer, heavier. "We work," Sani said, shifting the mood before it broke open into sadness. Walter nodded. "We work." They rose together, and the day moved forward. But something had changed. Names exchanged, truth shared, loss acknowledged, work decided together, not enforced. The ranch was no longer a place waiting to be left behind. IT was turning into something else, slow, fragile, real. And as Walter lifted the hammer and Ada Lee walked beside him, scanning the horizon for threats while he scanned fence boards for cracks, one thing became clear. He was no longer living just for quiet. He was living among the living. Again, the next day rose under a thin winter sun, the kind that brightened land without warming it. Frost still clung to the trough edges, and the ground held a stiff crunch under boots. Walter stepped out first, coat collar high, eyes sweeping the ridge lines before anything else. It had become habit in only a few days. Awareness sharper, steps quieter, no longer guarding just cattle and fences. Guarding lives. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Not fear this time, routine. Ada Lee walked out with 2 cups of coffee held carefully in both hands, steam drifting in light columns. She offered him one without a word. He accepted, fingers brushing the warm tin against her palm. The exchange lasted only a second, but something in it felt deliberate, not sentimental, mutual, a shared start to the day. The ranch had changed. You could feel it. Chickens clucked louder than they used to. The horses stood alert but calm, sensing extra hands moving near. And voices, low, careful, came from the barn as Mina and Nolly sorted feed. Even laughter sometimes flickered through the morning like a thin flame refusing to die. People listening to this story would want to know, what now? Were they planning to stay forever? Would soldiers return? Did Walter intend to involve the town? Could a single ranch hold against law and prejudice? Those answers hadn't shaped yet, but something important had. They were building a life, not just hiding. Walter drank slowly. "We should get the roof patched," he said, eyes on the barn loft. "Snow's coming. Sooner than looks." Ada Lee nodded. "We help. There's a ladder in the shed. Nails in the toolbox. I bring. Not I ask. That I bringed it." In hesitation. No waiting for permission. She walked off steady and sure. Walter watched her for a moment. The way she moved, quiet confidence, back straight, chin lifted, not like someone broken or saved, like someone choosing each step. When she disappeared behind the barn, Walter noticed movement near the edge of his pasture. Sonny and Chala were kneeling near the ground, turning soil with sticks and bare hands. Curious, he headed over. "What are you doing?" he asked. Sonny held up a handful of tiny speckled corn kernels and a small pouch of dried herbs. "We plant food. Winter coming. Better to give earth work too." Walter blinked. He had not planted since his wife passed. He'd kept shelves stocked, cattle fat, supplies planned the way lonely men plan. Enough for one, not enough to build a future. But these women were already planning. One. Chala brushed dirt from her fingers and looked up. "You have seeds? Beans? Squash. We stretch food." Her tone wasn't begging. It was capability looking for tools. Walter nodded slowly. "Root cellar. More inside." She grinned faintly, quick, almost surprising. "Then we not starve." Walter stiffened slightly at the bluntness, but he respected it. Hunger was not poetic. Hunger was truth. By midday, repairs were underway. Walter hammered new shingles while Ada Lee handed boards up from the ladder, steadying it with one hand and bracing the railing with her other. Below them, Mina practiced walking without favoring her injured ankle, slow steps across the yard, hand touching fences for balance. Nolly swept dust and loose hay into a pile, each stroke focused as if clearing the past herself. Sonny and Chala dug soil beds near the cabin foundation, shaping neat rows despite numb fingers. Questions from curious listeners hung beneath the surface. Would the town discover them? Would anyone else ride through? Could trust last? Life had no answer yet, only movement. Ada Lee glanced up. "Why you leave soldiers?" she asked, voice low but steady. Not prying. Try to understand the man who stood between them and danger. Walter paused mid-nail. The wind tapped his coat, and he stared out across the land. The memories that usually stayed locked behind the quiet breathed again. The border patrols, orders barked in dust storms, the look in eyes of people herded like animals. The battles that didn't feel like war, but punishment. "I saw things," he finally said. "Things I won't do again." Ada Lee did not push. Instead, she reached up another board. Then you're not like men who came after us. No, he said. I'm not that man anymore. Good, she replied, voice firm. We not run from here then. Walter blinked. She had not asked if they could stay. She decided. And somehow, he found himself relieved, and a shout cracked across the yard suddenly. Mina's voice, sharp and frightened, pointing toward the ridge that Walter's boot hit the roof edge hard as he pivoted. Dust cloud. Rider. Fast this time. Straight path. No hesitation. Inside, Walter barked. Not panic. Command. The women moved quick, practiced from fear, but disciplined from survival. Sani pulled Mina to shelter. Nali ducked behind the barn. Chala grabbed the knife they used for butchering. Adali didn't move away. She moved toward Walter, standing just beneath the ladder in case he needed to get down fast. Walter slid off the roof in 2 strides, rifle in his grip before his boots hit ground. His pulse pounded, not fear for himself, but calculation. 1 rider or more. Soldier or scout. Friendly or threat. The rider slowed near the fence. When the face came into focus, Walter's muscles eased a fraction. Not law, not soldier. Tom Branner, the nearest neighbor, 5 miles west. A man of few words, decent enough but loyal to his own survival first. Tom raised a hand. Saw smoke. Thought you had fire trouble. Walter's voice stayed calm, just clearing brush. Tom's eyes slid to the barn, to the tools, to the movement of something quick disappearing behind the hay bales that he frowned. You got help out here? Walter held his ground, working hands for a spell. Tom nodded slowly. Hard to find good labor these days. People move through. Walter replied, steady. Sometimes they stay a while. Tom leaned slightly forward in the saddle. You hear about those Apache girls that ran from Fort Spencer? Walter didn't blink, didn't breathe. Heard talk. Tom scratched his jaw. Town's wound up. Some men riding around thinking they'll earn favor turning them in. His tone suggested he didn't like it but wouldn't fight it either. Trust you'd say if you saw anything. Walter's fingers tightened on the rifle. Nothing here but chores. Tom studied him a moment too long. The horses behind the barn shifted. Adali stayed frozen, not cowering, not running, watching. Finally, Tom exhaled. Well, I'll get back. You watch yourself. Winter brings more than cold. Walter nodded once. Always does. Tom turned his horse and rode off slow, checking the tree lean once before disappearing beyond the ridge. Silence returned. He didn't relax until dust fully settled. Adali stepped out first. She didn't shake. She didn't sag. She simply approached Walter. You protect us again, she said quietly. Walter shook his head. I protected peace on my land. No, she corrected softly. You protect us. He didn't answer. His throat felt tight. Sani approached next. We not bring trouble, she said, heavy with guilt. Walter looked at them all. 5 women who had already rebuilt more in 2 days than he had in years. They worked his soil, fed his stock, shared his fire. They did not drain his world. They filled it. You didn't bring trouble, he said finally. The world brought it to you. I just won't help it along. Adali's eyes softened. Not pity, respect. The day quieted again. Wind against fences, horses snorting, the sound of women breathing after held fear. Work resumed slow, like a heartbeat finding rhythm again. But Walter knew a truth now as sure as winter's breath touched the air. This was not temporary. This was not mercy. This was choosing on both sides. Next time someone rode through,